Good evening, everybody. 2 days ago, I visited the Vatican museums, as I'm sure a lot of people here in the audience have done, and as hundreds of thousands of both art lovers and devout religious pilgrims have done, for a millennia now. Who could help but be impressed by what you see there? The treasures really represent the epitome of beauty and the accomplishments of human creativity. However, that's not the kind of art I want to talk about tonight. I'm going to talk about art that's more irreverent than reverent, and art that's more sensational and spectacular than it is sublime. The first image I want to show you is an image that over 25 or 30 years of studying provocative images is actually the most unsettling image I've ever seen in my life. Now, you may think that this is really a crazy statement, because you look at this, it's one white square against one red square. What's the big deal? What's wrong with this guy? The secret is in the title, Milk Blood. And when I saw this for the first time, I recalled the fact that my grandfather was a kosher butcher, and reminded me of the kosher laws, which dictate that you don't mix milk and meat. In fact, in the photograph, these liquids are not mixing. There seems to be this yellow line down the middle where the light's being reflected through the plexiglass, but in fact, it keeps them separate. Nevertheless, I left the gallery the first time I saw this very humbled, and it's a very sobering experience, because I realized that categories that I had formerly held to be quite valid were things that don't apply to my current life, but I realized how deeply felt these kinds of categories can be. Here's another image by Andre Serrano, and again, the clue is in the title, Piss Christ. It's a very controversial image. Many of the critics of this image argued that the urine was defiling the crucifix, but I think we can just as well turn that on its head and say that the crucifix was actually sanctifying the urine. A lot of what I'm saying tonight draws on the work of an anthropologist named Mary Douglas. And Mary Douglas talked about something that she called natural categories. What she argues is this, that every society in the world organizes experience in a certain way in terms of opposed binary categories. Some examples of those are public and private, sacred and profane, inside and outside, male and female. We know, however, these things mean very different things in different societies. Nevertheless, she argues that we always do that, no matter how we code particular issues. The problem comes in is when people smear the boundaries between these categories, which is something which contemporary artists seem to delight in. Another good example of this is a painting by Chris O'Feely called Holy Virgin Mary. You might be able to see that one of her breasts is composed of a lump of elephant dung. Once again, this kind of violation in terms of sacred and profane is profoundly unsettling to people. However, when it was shown in Brooklyn a few years ago, an order of nuns from Malawi wrote a letter to the director and was quite puzzled at the negative reaction. What they explained was they ran a rural nursing hospital, a place where women came from kilometers around, hundreds of kilometers around, to give birth. And when a woman was not able to produce her milk, they would wrap her breasts in elephant dung or some other kind of dung. And they found that after a couple of hours, probably because of the heat, that in fact the milk would flow. So for them, this was really a perfect image. Rather than in the West, as we think of waste products as filth, in this case, they saw a very close correspondence between what we would think as filth and what they were thinking of as life-giving, and very much consistent with what Chris O'Feely was referring to in this photograph. I'd like to switch the focus a little bit, or expand the focus, to talk about South Africa, which is a place which I've been visiting regularly for 15 years. If we want to talk about a place where there have been rigid boundaries, it would be South Africa. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with apartheid. The word itself is Afrikaans for separateness. And apartheid really micromanaged and dictated everything people did. It regulated social spaces, it regulated sexual behavior, it regulated everything people could do. Essentially, it regulated what you could do, who you could do it with, and where you could do it. Because we expect then in a society that's as rigid as that there would be some really prime examples of people smudging this line between natural categories. And in fact, South Africa has proved to be quite a testing ground for this. What you're seeing right now is a painting called The Spear by Brett Murray. Without doubt, the most controversial painting ever produced, or most controversial artwork actually ever produced in South African history. What it does here is that it smears that line between public and private by exposing President Jacob Zuma's penis in public. So it smears that line between public and private. It's based on a poster of Lenin, and it sparked enormous controversy in the country, which almost sparked a full-fledged race riot in South Africa. Among very profound protests against this painting, two men at separate times threw white paint on the canvas. There were numerous threats against the artist and his family, including a prominent religious leader who said he should be stoned to death. And it really dominated the headlines for several months in South Africa. There was really quite a startling statement made by a woman in the paper who was one of thousands of people who demonstrated outside the gallery. And she said the following. She said, "Zuma, he's a grandfather. This artist, he's a boy. He shows no respect. I will kill him." So as we can see, oftentimes these controversies don't allow a lot of room for rationality or rational talk. Another example of a controversial South African artist is Stephen Cohen. Here he's wearing this very elaborate chandelier tutu. He's known for his elaborate and outrageous costumes, and he disrupts public places oftentimes with his performances, a kind of action in public that has drawn out very, very strong responses, including being arrested. He's even been convicted for sexual exhibitionism in public, for a performance which included performing with a rooster tied to his penis. This is a much more tender side of Stephen Cohen. And here he's performing with a woman who's over 90 years old, who was the black woman who raised him. Once again, blurring this line between public and private. And in fact, I think what this photograph in some ways does is it points up the upending of the kind of racial regulation that happened in South Africa under apartheid. And it also brings up a very, very sensitive subject in the country where you had this very intimate relationship between black caregivers and their white subjects, which is really very integral to South African experience. Not surprisingly, this performance also triggered a great deal of controversy. Changing the focus then a little bit more, one of the most iconic aspects of the South African landscape around Johannesburg are these yellowish mine dumps, which represent the residue of the mining, which the basis on which the country is founded. So the city of Johannesburg's wealth and South Africa's wealth depends upon, or continues to depend upon, these gold mines. However, toxic waste blows over these mine dumps, and not surprisingly, it affects the most poor communities within South Africa, people who have little choice over where they live. This then is another way which a South African artist has actually addressed this very iconic aspect of South African experience. A photographer named Jason Larkin in this series called After the Mines. And in this very, very eerie and surrealistic landscape, he's found beauty. The story behind this is that this man was hired by a very wealthy man to exercise his dogs, his hunting dogs, daily on these man-made creations. And so an artist can look at this kind of phenomenon in a very, very different way from the way people do on a day-to-day basis. However, Mother Nature is promising perhaps a return of the repressed and a revenge which is monumental in its implications. Contaminated mine water, which surrounds the city of Johannesburg, is very silently rising. There are predictions that perhaps this mine water, which is suffused with chemicals as the byproduct of mining, could in fact rise up and flood the entire central business district of Johannesburg. And this too has been addressed by South African artists. Here we have a drawing by William Kentridge, a very famous South African artist, who is showing the mine dumps outside of Johannesburg. And he also shows this possibility of nature having its revenge on human creation. To kind of sum this up, in a lot of ways, contemporary artists, and particular artists like I've shown you tonight, remind me of practitioners of the ancient craft of cupping. And if you're familiar with cupping, cupping entails putting small glass domes on a person's body with the idea that the suction draws out toxins from that body. I think if we could expand this by looking at artists as potentially healers in a contemporary society, and what the art that they produce also potentially could control or pull out the toxins, the contamination, the so-called filth from the body politic, with the promise of potentially renewing the world that we live in. Thank you.